Ladies and gentlemen, let's get started here at ETHDenver. Very excited for this little chat, little fireside chat we've got going on here with Anthony Rose, Matter Labs SVP of Technology, to chat about ZK Sync, scaling Ethereum, how we can do this limitlessly, I believe, is what really the title was all about here, Anthony. I'm the co-founder of Trustless Media. I'm excited to be digging into this because we're all at ETHDenver to learn a little bit more about this technology and what it unlocks. And Anthony, I figured we'd start just with your background because you came from a big tech company that people might know in SpaceX and have a bunch of, I think, cool insights on why crypto matters. So why don't we just start about why you're working on ZK Sync right now to scale Ethereum and why you think this is such a huge opportunity and moment in time to be building on ETH.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, good place to start. So in terms of like why ZK Sync, why work on this? So for me personally, I've been following the space since 2013. So I was doing a postdoc at the time, became aware of Bitcoin through other people I was hanging around with doing physics, and it was one of like many people, right? Immediately you read the Bitcoin white paper and it resonates. And I'd followed the space off and on over the next however many years, probably with my level of interest kind of like peaking and waning, maybe as a function of everybody else's. But I kept coming back to it. And yeah, I was at SpaceX for like 4 years leading up to working on Matter Labs on ZK Sync. And you'd be working 12 plus hours on something completely unrelated, and then go home and read about DeFi protocols, or like look at NFTs, or dig into all of the technology that all of us are here to kind of dig into together today. And like when you feel that compulsion, you should explore it seriously. So I thought about the problems in the space, and for me, like Ethereum was the only chain that really offers the promise of what we think public blockchains can deliver, at least for me personally. So looking at the problems for Ethereum, scalability is the only one. If we don't solve that, I would argue that like, why do any of it? And to solve scalability, we have ZK. And inside ZK, I spoke to the Matter Labs team and was kind of just blown away by the quality of the team. Like the vision, the commitment to the mission, it was just obvious from my first phone call. And as I spoke to the engineers, I hadn't necessarily expected to leave SpaceX at the time.
Yep.
And then I was, handing my notice in shortly after.
I wonder sometimes too, and you're much more coming at this from a technical lens than I am, maybe perhaps, in terms of how this technology can be used. And now, as we've arrived here, right? It was hard before to kind of the gas fees on Ethereum were one thing, but now the solutions, there are so many. And so maybe get into a little bit of what makes ZK Sync different from the other solutions to scale Ethereum and what the big unlock is.
So yeah, huge number of different scaling solutions. I would argue that if we look over the last couple of years, the ones that really hold the most promise are the rollups. They don't offer as many compromises as previous attempts at scaling Ethereum, and they really broadly fall out into two categories. We have the optimistic systems and we have the ZK systems. The ZK systems are coming into maturity now. And optimistic systems, I think, were a fantastic technology to relieve the pressure on layer one, but you have game theoretic guarantees to correctness. With ZK, you have mathematical guarantees, right? And you have the ability to not require this like week-long fraud challenge window. You can get to the point of like instant guarantees to the state transition and fast finality on layer one. For ZK Sync in particular, because even inside ZK, there's many great teams building, everyone with different design decisions. I would argue that we've optimized for the future, right? So we've optimized for a system that is super high performance in ZK. We've optimized for an architecture that we think gives us the ability to make the system extremely cheap. And really trying to build an execution environment that we imagine builders being able to like build really interesting, fantastic user experiences on that move us beyond kind of where the space is today to a world where you've got like the internet of value on chain. So it's like performance and price and a really amazing user experience.
Yeah, I think the trade-offs in each technical team and how you want to scale Ethereum are always interesting to get into because there are trade-offs at the end of the day, right? And one of them, I suppose, is kind of how you build out in this idea of why everyone's trying to scale Ethereum is because there's community there and there's builders here at this conference that you might not have in other ecosystems. And getting into that technically, like EVM compatibility versus equivalency, things like that. Talk to me about the trade-offs that your guys' team looked at in how you wanted to attack this, I guess, differently than others.
Yeah, this is probably like the maybe most fundamental design choice. But at least as we were thinking about this, the EVM was designed prior to anybody thinking about using ZK, right? So the design of the system isn't trivially provable when it comes to building this cryptographic proof systems. And these systems are complex. And what we're building is a virtual machine. The virtual machine will be running a bunch of compute. But to do the corresponding computations in zero knowledge can be orders of magnitude more expensive than doing them in a regular virtual machine. So we designed the virtual machine to be efficiently provable. But this meant that you actually end up having to implement the system in a very different way so that you can make the user experience feel like the EVM. So users can still write their smart contracts in Solidity or Viper, compile them, deploy them. It should behave as it does on layer 1. But the system itself is very different, and it's designed for that performance. And I think we're starting to see the benefits of some of these decisions, right? We've, I think, demonstrated the most performance of all rollups, ZK or optimistic, on mainnet. And it's the cheapest. So it's like the fastest and the cheapest, which for the execution environment, like obviously critical characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah, I was talking to one project today, and they were talking about some of those trade-offs and the idea of maybe the edge cases of copying over in terms of EVM compatibility and what that looks like. And obviously, again, there are always trade-offs. When it comes to that and the incentive structure, I'm sure you get asked all the time, as any project in crypto does, when token, what does this look like in terms of the incentives to build with your team versus others? I mean, it's interesting to think about the incentives and the token, everything in the space right now. The excitement's back around that. How have you guys looked at it in terms of, I guess, a snapshot, airdrops? What does that look like? And is it maybe asked too often?
I mean, too often is subjective, right? But I probably get of the order of 50 Twitter DMs a day on the topic.
That seems lower than I would have expected.
Well, yeah, don't read the other folder.
Sure.
But at least nothing to announce, right? Like for us, we are building. We haven't needed a token, so we don't have a token. I think, at some point in the future, if it changed, like we would be the first to be talking about it. But at least for now, we don't, have a token to talk about. But when it comes to incentives, like if I think about putting my getting in the mindset of like the builders who are building on these systems today, like if I was building an application, I would want to design it and build it on a platform that I actually believed could get to the point where like millions of users can use this application, right? Like if you're looking at systems that are limited by the performance or they're fundamentally expensive, just like with layer 1, right? Like you can't build applications that huge scale on a system that doesn't scale. So the incentives for me are like if you're building, you want to choose the execution environment that you can believe in and you can be successful with.
I think what's interesting too is, when we think about this conference, maybe a lot of explanations don't need to happen here when you're talking about, zero knowledge proofs. When we remove ourselves from ETHDenver, maybe there is a bit more, right? And right now we're seeing a lot of excitement in the Bitcoin ecosystem because of a very simple narrative of, hey, Wall Street just figured this out, and now there's a lot of money coming in and number go up. When it comes to like your excitement as someone who is deep at SpaceX and in physics and working on telescopes and like what do you see as kind of the demand side of what your technology unlocks, and maybe not now but in 5-10 years time what it unlocks?
I mean, the thing that first appealed to me when I was really thinking seriously about the move was it feels like we're on the cusp of a phase transition, right? Where we can really see a world with much, much better financial infrastructure. And, as I've been deeper into the space over the last few years, like, we can see now the path to an architecture that can basically provide the backbone for an internet of value, right? Like a world in which you have the properties that we like about public blockchains, right? You have self-custody, but they're accessible to everybody. And they're accessible without the security compromises that we've seen on, alt-1s. And you can really imagine a much fairer and more equitable world. And some of the things that I think in the West that we take for granted can be made much more accessible. And then beyond that, just, the level of creativity in terms of the application layer is something that excites me, right? Like NFTs are a thing I for sure wouldn't have predicted. And the unpredictability of it as well, I also just find very compelling. And, people building things on ZK Sync that surprise me is, always a source of pleasure.
Yeah, I mean, what we've built at Coinage in terms of being a community-owned show might not be as complex as maybe some of the other things that are built on-chain in terms of NFT equals membership equals ownership of what we're building. But for the other pieces there, like, talk to me about the technical unlocks of the early builders in your guys' ecosystem for kind of what you have to point to, because the activity is up, right? When you look at kind of what you guys have been able to show in the early days, even without a token. So I can't imagine what it might look like in the future, but what has you most excited right now?
I probably wouldn't want to pick one project over another because at least for me, I really want our system to be a platform on which, independent of our personal preferences, we attempt to really engage with all builders, right? So there's obviously DeFi, there's games, there's NFT projects. To a first approximation, all of the things that are being built on Ethereum, we see versions of them, or the L2 version exactly, being deployed and starting to thrive on ZK Sync. Yeah, I have the things that I like the most, but also I try to use everything on ZK Sync, right? I really want to build the best system that we can. We have to be users of it. So I play with everything. So yeah, some I like more than others, but it's kind of just cool to get a flavor of everything that everyone's building and also to try and engage with the building community itself directly.
Yeah, when you think about, I guess, obviously it becomes a little bit easier maybe to explain to other people who might look at your decision to leave SpaceX versus now when, the excitement is back in the space. But for you, I mean, I guess, how do you contextualize, building day in, day out in this ecosystem and why you do it on a very personal level? Because I could answer that, and I think it's really cool to see ownership, like you said, in the media space as creators working with their fans and people who are interested in crypto news. But for you, what is the unlock in terms of why you're here?
I mean, I just deeply and genuinely want this system to exist. I think a world in which these systems exist is strictly better than a world in which they don't. And, the motivation every day is to keep pushing the system forward. We spent the first year that I was here sort of building towards that mainnet launch, which was an interesting and exciting time because you have this amazing thing and you want to bring it to life. So you push every day to get it there. And then it's live and it's a very different world, right? You never know what to expect when these systems turn on. It's a permissionless system, and people can do things with it that you don't predict. And I didn't know how much usage to expect, right? We see a lot of variety, and it was very hard to predict which systems would get a lot of activity. But as you mentioned, right, transactions are up, TVL is up, addresses are up, people are building, people are deploying, but it still feels like we're just getting started. So feels as exciting as day one.
What would you say, I guess, is one of the things that people get wrong when you look at your technology, and you mentioned kind of the differentiation between a zero-knowledge proof and the other existing implementations of scaling Ethereum? I mean, what's kind of one thing that you would clear up at a conference like this?
There's a bunch. And honestly...
Well, we only have 6 minutes left, so yeah.
The first one that I think is a difficult message, not just for the ZK Sync, but for teams building ZK systems in the space already, is to really highlight the advantages that ZK gives you over optimistic systems. And I think in the short term, these systems don't feel very different, right? To a first approximation, you use any of them today, and they're okay, the user experience is roughly similar. In the long term, it's completely different.
How so?
I mean, thinking about where we're going, right? If you think about these systems, the Internet of Value cannot run on one L2, right? So all of us, to a first approximation, are thinking about the real scaling problem. The real scaling problem isn't, maximize the hell out of this L2. It's think about how these things scale horizontally. And to scale horizontally, you can do this today with the framework we built. So we open sourced the code base for Era called the ZK Stack. So you can deploy hyperchains into this ecosystem. And it's through ZK that you can do permissionless, asynchronous message and value passing. So, with an optimistic system where you've got a 7-day challenge period, I mean, imagine if you tried to open a hyperlink on the internet and it took 7 days to respond. Right? It's and this is a fundamental limit of that system.
Yep.
And ZK lets you go fast, right? And we're going to get ZK to the point where it's basically real time. So you can build these composable systems that can scale to the what we need for the internet value. So this is a fundamental misunderstanding, and I think people building on optimistic systems, if you look at L2Beat, which is an amazing tool for understanding the space, it is phenomenally complex to understand the properties of each of these, the risks associated to each of them, and let alone like what this will look like in 5, 10, however many years.
Yep.
So I think on the ZK side, we need to do a better job of like helping builders understand this because they just need to focus on building, right? And the infrastructure, yeah, they shouldn't worry about.
Well, you mentioned, I think, putting it all on one chain, the internet today, like in 2024, and seeing right now what's happening with AI, I feel like is a good example to point to in terms of how big this can all get as it expands, right? And it's really hard to predict. And I think a lot of this stuff takes longer than it does, you know? People have been talking about self-driving car, and you know, I feel like for forever. But now that AI is here in a way that this all kind of can really start to get out of hand very fast. I mean, how much does that accelerate the need for technologies like the one you're building?
I would say it's not obvious to me that AI is going to be the thing that we really focus on in the near term. And I could be completely wrong, and this is like maybe even people that I work closely with would disagree with me. But for me, like, the first and most important use case that we've seen for these systems is around financial assets, right? Like around payments, around things of that form. And I think today, these systems could solve problems that I imagine in the Web 2 world, if people understood what these solutions could do already, they would be embracing them in a way that they aren't yet. So yeah, you know, once you are able to build this like composable system that can scale horizontally, people also can configure their environments in a way that makes sense for their use case, right? You can build private rollups, essentially, so that you can start to build really interesting technical solutions to, you know, problems that normal people have, and abstract the technology away and just like really start to build a modern financial ecosystem.
Before we popped up here on stage, we were talking about your path here, your road here. You've been working on this now for a little over 2 years, right? In your position as SVP of tech. I mean, 2 years in the bear ages some people. I certainly felt aged, and now it's, you know, the tides are turning. You personally, I mean, how was it building in the bear, and how different maybe it feels now as, I hope, we've turned the corner in the excitement being back?
I still don't feel like we're in the bull properly yet, which is maybe wild given the price of Bitcoin this week. But building without the noise, I think, is really helpful, right? Like the system, there's just like a lot of work to do, and it lets you focus in a way that, you know, the prices can be distracting.
Prices can be distracting, yes.
But actually, like, to a first approximation, I haven't seen any difference in the last few months relative to the 2 years before, right? Like, we're engineers building the system that we want to build, and like, what's going on around us is less interesting. We have a very long-term view.
Well, let's look ahead to the long-term view because we've got 2 minutes left, and I feel like looking ahead to what comes next, obviously, as you said, you get asked about tokens every day, so I'm not going to ask you again, but for the roadmap and how you start to use the technology, what should people keep their eyes out for how ZK Sync starts to actually make it into the real world in a new way?
I think that, like, coming back to the two properties, if I think about Era, like the system that we have running now on mainnet, we've been pushing performance beyond what everybody else is doing, and we're going to push it way further. Like, it's going to surprise people when it's live. And then on price, right? We have 4844 coming in a few weeks. We're going to be ready on day one. So the way that we've designed the system lets us really build an execution environment that's going to be killer. And I think it's going to surprise people. But the really exciting thing for me is actually this hyperchain ecosystem. We have a bunch of partners now building. They have testnets running, mainnets coming live. And we're going to start to see like real interoperability through ZK and real like scaling through ZK. And you know, we're going to go from hundreds of TPS to thousands of TPS. And across the hyperchain ecosystem, you know, yeah, like an environment of huge amounts of execution, super cheap transactions, and yeah, builders will finally have an ecosystem on which you can build applications that really scale.
I think it's a great point to end on because you're right. We are so close to that upgrade Denkun looming in the near future. But it's been fascinating to hear kind of your thoughts on this. So I appreciate you sitting down here at ETHDenver with us, Anthony Rose, Matter Labs, SVP of Technology. Thank you again, man.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Thanks, everybody.